because Lewis writes with such immediacy and vividness. It's like 1,000 volts jolting right through you, because he had such a powerful mind, and such a he as people said about him after his death, he took in more, he felt more, he saw more, he sensed more than the average person. But the unusual thing about him was that he was able to communicate much of that.
Hello, Bible lovers. Welcome to another episode of Unscrolled, Museum of the Bible's podcast, exploring the history, the narrative, and ongoing impact of the Bible on our world and our lives today. C.S. Lewis is the topic today. He's an author that impacted countless lives through his writings, his speeches, and more. He's best known for his Narnia series, obviously, Mere Christianity, Screwtape Letters, and there's a lot more that people typically are not exposed to, and we'll talk to some of it today. We have a guest today, Dr. Michael Ward, a theologian, a literary scholar, an author, college professor in Oxford, Hillsdale College here in the US and in Houston, Texas, a speaker, and a movie star. We'll get to that in a moment. So some may think he can't decide between all those things that he's doing, but the common thread to all of it is that his focus on the life and works of C.S. Lewis. It's fair to say that Dr. Ward is one, if not the recognized authority on C.S. Lewis. We're honored to have you here today. Welcome, Dr. Ward, to Unscrolled.
My great pleasure. Thank you for having me, Matthias.
Yeah, you're in Oxford right now, right? In your study?
I am speaking to you from my home in Oxford, England. Yes, this is my little study where I do most of my work.
Yeah. Before we get to Lewis, I mentioned you were a movie star before. Tell us a little bit about your. I guess that was your career before you got into the academic route, right? But tell us a little bit about your James Bond adventure.
Well, I got into that James Bond movie. It was The World Is Not Enough with Pierce Brosnan, through my interest in C.S. Lewis, because there was a film made about C.S. Lewis here in Oxford in 1993, Shadowlands, with Anthony Hopkins, a Richard Attenborough movie. Very good film, not at all accurate to Lewis's life, but worth watching. And having got into that as an extra, I then did quite a bit of other film and TV work as an extra. And one day, the agency that organised the extras rang me up and said, "Do you want to be in the James Bond movie?" So I said, "Oh yes, I'll do that." And unusually, in fact, unprecedentedly, uniquely, I was not in a huge crowd scene with thousands of other extras, but I was in a scene with just the main stars of the film. James Bond, Q, who gives James Bond all his gadgets, and John Cleese, the British comedian, whom they were positioning to take over from Q. So it was just those three and me in a scene where I handed James Bond a pair of X-ray spectacles for him to play with. It took 2 days to film that scene, though it lasts about 17 seconds in the actual movie run. And I wondered why I was asked to have the role, because I got no special acting ability. But when I looked at the other 9 extras who were summoned for that day's shoot, I realized I was the only one who was bald with glasses. And I wanted this sort of egghead, nerdy, sort of boffin kind of look. So I like to say there are some advantages to losing your hair and losing your eyesight.
Well,
not many, but I found them on this occasion.
Well, I assume you could retire right now and live off your royalties from that movie, right?
No. I got a one-off payment, which was not very handsome. I got extra money. I was paid additional sum of £25 because I gave an angry look to James Bond as he snatched these X-ray specs out of my hand. And when I was paid at the end of the day, the chap who was dishing out the money said, "Oh, you're the guy who gave him the angry look, aren't you? You get extra 25 quid for that." And he ticked a box labelled creative reactions.
No way.
I did actually act. I was not just a body in a space, but I was not credited. I was just, one of the great unwashed, ahoy polloi.
Wow. Well,
But what,
maybe there's a role in one of the kind of sequels or whatever else of C.S. Lewis in there for you, but that'd be fantastic, right?
well, the only time I can really claim to have acted in a movie was in a much more recent thing called The Most Reluctant
Yeah,
Convert, The Untold Story of C.S. Lewis. And there I do actually have lines,
yeah.
and I play C.S. Lewis's parish priest.
The vicar,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
and that was great fun. Yeah.
Oh. Well, so we are at C.S. Lewis. How did you get involved? What's your story? Everybody has their own kind of connection. I think with you, it started in your childhood, right?
Yes, it started for me, like I think it probably starts for most people who have an interest in Lewis. I had the Narnia books read to me when I was a kid. My parents read them to me and my two older brothers, and I liked them right from the start. And as soon as I was old enough to read them for myself, I did so. And then I got into his other fiction and his Christian apologetics. I went through all of that in my teenage years. I came to Oxford to do my undergrad. I did an English degree here, and that was when I first studied C.S. Lewis formally. I did an undergraduate thesis on him. And as a result of that, I was asked to give a one-off lecture for Oxford after I graduated, and then a short course of tuition. And little by little, I did more speaking, teaching, writing about Lewis. I even ended up living in his house, the Kilns, here in Oxford for 3 years.
Yeah.
Lived in his bedroom and study for 3 years. That was great fun. And then when the time came for me to do my PhD, Lewis was the obvious choice because I was already fairly expert in his writings. And that's how I ended up with a career teaching, writing, speaking about Lewis. I never planned it. It just sort of snowballed out of my genuine interest and love for the man and his writings.
Well, but if you write, what is it, 4 or 5 books about C.S. Lewis, there's got to be more than the kind of childlike attraction to him. So what is it that really attracted you to him? If you specific in theology, there's many things you can do that's kind of closer tied to the Bible, but you chose C.S. Lewis. Why is that?
Mm. Well, I liked the fact that Lewis was both theologically interested and literarily interested, because theology and English lit have always been my two big subjects.
Yeah.
I've always had a passion for those, and I'm uninterested in almost everything else. So here's a man who not only combines those two interests, but also does so in a great variety of different ways. So he's got his Christian apologetics, like Mere Christianity, the problem of pain, miracles, defending the faith. He's got his fiction, Narnia, Screwtape, The Great Divorce, and the rest. Behind that, he's got his own academic expertise, because, of course, he was neither an apologist nor a novelist professionally. He was an academic. He taught here at Oxford for most of his career. So he was a very distinguished scholar of medieval and Renaissance literature. In addition to all that, he had a fascinating life, very interesting upbringing, war experience, a most unusual marriage, which was the subject of that movie Shadowlands that I mentioned. So it's very difficult to ever get bored of Lewis because there's just so much going on in his life and in his works. And then, of course, he was best friends with Tolkien, another great writer. So my interest in Lewis has gradually taken me into Tolkien a little bit as well. And what's not to like about Lewis and Tolkien? It's great. I think I'm the most fortunate man in the world to have a career, basically, spending all my working time studying these two fascinating men.
So you basically spent your whole professional career around a man. You lived in this house, you actually slept in the room that he slept in.
Yeah, you're right. I do know C.S. Lewis very well indeed. And I've now sort of immersed myself in his mind and in his imagination so thoroughly that I think I'm well equipped, if I may say so, to understand some of the subtleties of Lewis as a writer. And that's really what I discovered in the course of my PhD researches, that there's a lot more going on in Lewis's writings than meets the eye. One of the reasons he was so brilliant as a writer is that he's able to layer his writings. He gives you a very appealing, accessible story in Narnia, for instance, but behind it, there's a lot going on. Not just the fairly obvious biblical parallels in the Narnia books, but his whole medievally informed imagination and the medieval cosmos, which he loved so much, that also plays a huge part in the Narnia books, and that's what my book Planet Narnia is all about. So, yeah, he's the sort of writer who, the more you study, the more you discover about him. You don't actually get to the end of him.
Well, for those not familiar with Lewis's life and specifically his faith, tell us a little bit about how he got into this, this journey from growing up as an unbeliever to kind of some sort of an atheist to a reluctant convert. You used that, or kind of a deist to all the way to a Christian apologetic. What was that journey like for him? Introduce us to C.S. Lewis from that perspective.
Yeah, well, he was raised in a Christian family. In fact, his grandfather was a clergyman in the Church of Ireland, which is part of the Anglican Communion. So he was taken to church, he was taught all the normal things, he said, and he believed what he was told for at least the first, roughly 12 years of his life. But in his early teens, he turned his back on the faith, and for the next roughly 2 decades, he was calling himself an unbeliever. He, first of all, was an atheist. Then he became more sort of agnostic. Then he became a theist. So he began to believe in God, not specifically the Christian God. And finally, in no small part, thanks to the influence of Tolkien, he returned all the way back to Christianity. And so from about the age of 32, he was calling himself a Christian and was, fully committed to the faith. He was described by one person as the most converted man he ever knew. So although he was, by his own reckoning, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England when he became a theist, his final conversion to Christianity was much less reluctant. It was really wholehearted and complete and thoroughgoing, and it really marks the hinge about which his whole life turned, because it was about midway through his life that he returned to the Christian faith, and soon after that he began to write his more obviously Christian works, like, for instance, The Problem of Pain. That was his first essay in Christian apologetics.
So what caused that? What caused that turn from faith, and what caused the return to faith?
Well, what caused his abandonment of the faith was a variety of things. One was that he said that his schoolmasters informed him and all his schoolmates that Christianity was 100% true, and all other religions, including the ancient myths of Greece and Rome, which Lewis really knew and loved from an early age, were 100% false. Now, Lewis was not so much troubled by the first claim that Christianity was 100% true, but he was troubled by the claim that every other worldview was 100% wrong. And he thought, well, that's not very likely, is it? How fortunate, how convenient that our religion happens to be the perfect one and everything else is utterly wrong. That doesn't seem likely. So that was one of the reasons for his initial skepticism about what he was being told. He thought, you're overstating the claim. He was unusually intelligent and well-read from an early age. He also, it must be said, had sort of emotional reasons for turning his back on the faith, namely that his mother died when he was 10 years old. And he had prayed for her healing, but she was not healed. He says that this didn't, at least consciously, have an effect in his turning his back on Christianity, but it's hard to believe that it played no part. And
so how did he turn back?
Yeah, well, his turn back to the faith occurred, as I mentioned, in part because of the influence of Tolkien. And there was a famous conversation that Lewis had with Tolkien and another friend called Hugo Dyson. Dyson and Tolkien were Christians. Lewis at this stage was sort of a theist, but not yet a Christian. And Tolkien and Dyson sort of helped Lewis over the final stile, he said. That they helped him clear the final obstacle to Christian belief by telling him that you loved the myths of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and these myths of dying and rising gods, don't you? And Lewis had to admit that he did. He said he'd always been strangely moved by Adonis and Bacchus and Balder, the corn gods, these mythological characters whom he marinated himself in for years as a schoolboy. He'd always found them profound, suggestive of meanings beyond his grasp. He couldn't say in cold prose what they meant, but then he didn't want to say in cold prose what they meant. He was happy to experience the warm prose of the story and just rest in the story. And so Tolkien said to Lewis, think of Christianity in a similar way. Think of Christianity, first and foremost, as a story, as a sequence of events, of characters in places doing things. Except with Christianity, these are real people. There's a historical claim to Christianity that nobody would ever make for Adonis and Bacchus and Balder. Christianity is a myth, but it is the true myth. It's the story of the dying and rising God that actually happened in recorded history, with definable historical consequences. You know, there's documentary evidence, there's archaeological evidence in support of this story. But treat it first and foremost as a story. Live the story. Find your part in this drama, and don't try to analyze it. Don't try, first and foremost, to translate it into concepts and ideas, into doctrines, into a system of thought, into theological categories. Those doctrines, that doctrinal language, Tolkien said, is valuable. Yeah, very important. I mean, both Tolkien and Lewis are intellectuals. They're not going to say anything against mental clarity and philosophical, formulation. But Tolkien insisted to Lewis that the language most adequate for Christianity is the lived language, the real historical language of a real man in a real time, in a real place, doing real things. Whereas doctrinal language, language about redemption and soteriology and ecclesiology and all those ologies that theologians come up with to try to explain the faith, they come after the fact. They are secondary, they are ancillary. And so you mustn't let the tail wag the dog. You mustn't get focused in on the doctrines at the expense of the historical story. And although this sounds like a simple solution to a problem, it was just the solution that Lewis needed, because he'd basically been putting the cart before the horse. He'd been worrying away at the doctrinal language, but he couldn't make very good sense of it. But once he saw, no, well, that's only secondary. The primary language, the language most adequate, is the lived language. Then he thought, oh, right, it's like a shoulder blade being knocked back into place. And after that conversation, he very soon had a conversion experience. He writes about this in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. And he says that the conversation with Tolkien and Dyson had a good deal to do with that final conversion experience.
It seems fascinating that, even though Tolkien and Dyson brought him back to faith, to Christianity, Lewis was more explicit in the message of his writings in terms of Christianity. If you look at The Lord of the Rings, much more. You can draw some connections to Christianity, but Lewis actually went down the route of kind of being inspired by his faith, right?
Yes, inspired to write both novels and stories and actual defenses of the faith. Tolkien didn't feel that was his gifting. Tolkien didn't ever write much in the way of explicit defenses of the faith. His essay on fairy stories, Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, is probably the closest example of his doing that, where he talks about the eucatastrophe, the good catastrophe that you find in fairy tales and the great myths. He says, well, Christianity is the incarnation of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history, and the resurrection of Christ is the eucatastrophe of the incarnation. He says that in his essay on fairy stories. But Tolkien didn't feel that he was equipped to give apologetics for the faith in the way that Lewis did. Lewis, we must remember, he began his career at Oxford teaching philosophy, and he was a born debater. He loved dialectic. He involved himself thoroughly in the Oxford Socratic Club. He was the president of that club for years, and that was a club designed to invite non-believers to come and debate with believers about issues of faith. And Tolkien just wasn't built that way. He was much more interested in language. He was a professor of philology, and then in how languages undergird a story and a mythic world. That's how The Lord of the Rings came to be written, through Tolkien's love of language.
Yeah, funny you mentioned the Socratic Club. I read about a debate, one of the very few ones that C.S. Lewis actually lost against Elizabeth Anscombe, a Roman Catholic philosopher at the Socrates Club. I think it was somewhere in the 40s where they debated, and she brought in the kind of the supernatural dimension of faith and challenged him on it, specifically miracles. Is that something that could have been a trigger for him to explore this dimension of faith, specifically when it comes to Narnia stories?
Yes, that debate at the Socratic Club with Elizabeth Anscombe was unusual, in fact, unprecedented, in that it was really the only occasion where clearly Lewis lost the debate. They were debating Lewis's recent book on miracles, and in particular, its third chapter. And Elizabeth Anscombe, who was a young pugilistic philosopher, she trained under Wittgenstein at Cambridge. She zeroed in on some of Lewis's argumentation and said, "You need to tighten up your language. You're blurring your terms." And Lewis was sort of rocked back on his heel because he wasn't expecting that sort of surgical precision. Because, Elizabeth Anscombe had no trouble with miracles or with Christianity. As you say, she was a very devout Catholic, but she wanted Lewis to give the best philosophical defense for the faith that could be mounted. And she thought that he hadn't done that. And he actually came to agree with her. And he later rewrote that chapter in Miracles, taking into account her criticisms. But before he rewrote Miracles, he turned to the writing of the Narnia books. The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is first mentioned by Lewis just about 6 months after the debate. And lots of people have said there seems to be some sort of connection between the debate and the first Narnia book. Some people have said, oh, it's because Lewis found he couldn't hack it as a philosopher. He turns to fantasy instead. He gives up his intellectual defense of the faith and turns to fairy tale, which is, I think, absolutely nonsense. But I do think there is some sort of connection between the debate and the first Narnia book. Because in the book Miracles, Lewis is arguing for an understanding of nature which is not purely naturalistic. We are more than mere matter. We have brains. We are able to think rationally. And our capacity to think rationally is itself a kind of miracle. That we don't just exist on the material plane. We are spiritual beings as well. We can think logically. We can ratiocinate. Our minds can expand to the furthest corners of the universe as we think about logical relations. And that's a kind of miracle in itself. Now, once you've admitted that there's more than just one kind of reality, that there's not just matter, but there's also rationality, this sort of pervasive spirit of logic in the universe, well, then you're getting close to the source of spirituality, the ultimate uncreated logos, God himself. And that was Lewis's method of argumentation. And he had to rethink his argument after the debate with Anscombe. And I think he tried to retell his argument to himself in story form. How can I put this into a narrative? And that, I think, is what he's trying to do in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, with the imagery of Jupiter, of joviality, the jovial spirit, which informs that first story. But that's a whole other argument, which we probably don't have time to get into.
Yeah. Oh, you spent your whole life, and we have 60 minutes here to talk about this. So obviously, we have to cut a few pieces out. But you brought up the point of rationality. I feel, sometimes in Western Christianity or Western culture, where whether it's the old world, UK, Germany, or the new world here in the US, we're rather rational and systematic, specifically when it comes to our faith. And I wonder if this mystic dimension of faith and Narnia really capturing and diving into this dimension of our faith, if that's the secret of success of Narnia, specifically here in the U.S. I would say in the United States, Lewis's work, specifically the fiction stories, are more popular than anywhere else in the world. Is that the clue? This mystic, this supernatural approach to explaining our faith and the dynamics behind it?
Well, I think that's one of the secrets to Lewis's genius, that he was able to think very rationally. He was trained as a philosopher. He was a logician. He prized clarity and lucidity. But he also saw that doesn't get at the heart of things, because the heart of things is mysterious. It's real, it's lived. It's not just analyzed and spoken about after the fact. This is, tying back very much to what we were just talking about, his conversion. That it's the lived experience of God and faith that constitutes the Christian life. And a lot of talk about it, turning it into a set of propositions that you just assent to with the sort of surface of your mind, that's very thin gruel. That's not what Christianity is really about. That's more like religious studies than actual Christian faith. And so this is why Lewis has such a high place for the imagination. He distinguishes between the imagination and the reason. He says imagination is the organ of meaning. Reason is the natural organ of truth. And reason depends upon imagination, because something can only be true if it already means something. And it's imagination's job to provide meaningful things. And then reason comes down, as it were, and adjudicates, oh, this thing means truly, and this thing means incorrectly. But reason depends upon imagination. Imagination is fundamental to our whole knowledge of reality. So the only question is, what meaningful things are we going to use in the way we talk about life and faith? Are we going to talk about quantities? Are we going to use the language of mathematics, of number, statistics, equations, purely logical relations? Or are we going to talk more qualitatively about persons and relationships and atmospheres? Because most of our life is lived qualitatively more than quantitatively. I mean, quantities certainly have their value. Lewis has nothing against mathematics, but he's saying most of our life can't be quantified. It can't be measured. And to talk about it then intelligently and adequately, you need to move into the language of symbol and metaphor and allusion and connotation and indeed myth. So Lewis had a very high place in his scheme of things for the mythic, and that's why he calls Christianity the true myth. It's the best story. I mean, it's the greatest story ever told, but you can't turn a story adequately into number, obviously, any more than you can turn it adequately into a simple system of doctrinal categories. Those things have their value. Lewis got nothing against them. You've just got to get first things first. And the first thing is the mysterious reality of our lives that are coming to us three-dimensionally at every moment. And a lot of that is beyond language.
So let's dive deeper at this point. One of the dimensions you focus a lot. You wrote one book, Planet Narnia, to write about the depth of symbolism in what he writes. And we typically, in general public, look at Narnia as the story of secret doors and obscure creatures. But there was way more. It's going way deeper in Lewis writes, and it's oftentimes not perceived as that for the general public. Explain to us specifically the planetary theory that you pitch in Planet Narnia.
Thank you. Yes, Narnia is multi-layered. That's the interesting thing. It can be read very simply by a 5-year-old kid for the story, for going through magic wardrobes and finding talking creatures and fauns and giants and dragons. It can also be understood biblically, with the fairly clear biblical parallels between Aslan and Jesus, between, the Genesis creation account and the magician's nephew, where Aslan sings Narnia into being, or between, say, the book of Revelation, the final judgment, and the apocalypse in the Bible, and you get in Narnian terms the last battle, where Aslan brings Narnia to an end and recreates it. The biblical parallels are fairly clear if you're biblically literate. And not everybody is, of course, so a lot of people miss these things. But they don't exhaust Lewis's purposes, because underneath both the simple story level and the obvious biblical parallels, there's this fundamental imaginative scheme, in my view, which derives from Lewis's scholarly expertise in medieval literature. He had a huge respect for the 7 heavens. He described the 7 planets of medieval cosmology as spiritual symbols of permanent value, which were especially worthwhile in his own generation. And he writes about them extensively in his academic books. He puts them very explicitly into his Ransom trilogy. He also talks about them a lot in his poetry. In Narnia, he uses the 7 heavens again, but this time implicitly. He takes these 7 spiritual symbols and he uses them, I believe, as his imaginative blueprint for each book.
Explain really quick for those not familiar the 7 heavens.
Yeah, the best way to understand the 7 heavens is by reference to the days of the week. There's 7 days a week. And they get their names from the 7 planets, or the 7 planetary deities. So think of Saturday, Saturn Day. Sunday, the day of the sun. So the sun was a planet in medieval cosmology. Monday, Moon Day. The moon, again, was a planet in medieval thinking. And then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. If you think in Spanish or French, the connection is a bit more obvious than it is in English. Because Tuesday, Tu, is the Norse equivalent of Mars. Martes in Spanish, or Mardi in French. And so Mercury for Wednesday, Jupiter, Jove for Thursday, Venus for Friday, Freya being the Norse equivalent of Venus. These are the 7 heavens. This is how the universe was understood since time immemorial, until the telescope was invented in the 17th century, and people began to perceive that there were more planets.
So Lewis borrowed this understanding and injected into the Narnia story. Is that right?
He did, I believe. As did other writers he studied, like Dante and Chaucer. They used the planets all over the place for Christian purposes. And so Lewis takes one planet per book, and he takes its qualities, its influences, its characteristics, and he uses them as the sort of matrix out of which the story will emerge. So, just to give one example, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is the Jupiter story. In my view, it's the Jove book. Who does not need to be reminded of Jove, Lewis said. And joviality, the quality of Jove, of Jupiter, is principally kingliness. So we think of Aslan, the king of the wood. He's the king of the beasts. He's the true king. He's royal. He's solemn. His kingliness, his royalty is constantly emphasized in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Further, the children become kings and queens themselves as they live into his royalty. Winter passes. Now, if you look at how Lewis writes about Jupiter in his poems, he says that winter past and guilt forgiven are two of the results of Jupiter's influence. The passing of winter, the forgiving of guilt. That happens when Jupiter's influence is exerting itself. And of course, the White Witch has made it always winter, seemingly, but never Christmas in this first Narnia book. And her white winter, her wintry landscape is defeated at the coming of Aslan. And Edmund's guilt is forgiven. The treacherous Edmund, who's betrayed his brother and sisters, his guilt is forgiven. So everywhere you look in the story, you find jovial manifestations, and Aslan sums them up in his own person. So he's the true Jupiter. So Lewis is doing what he calls transferred classicism here. He's taking a classical character, Jupiter, and transferring it into his Christian art. He's exploiting classical mythology for Christian purposes, which is a technique used all over the Middle Ages by people like Dante and Chaucer. And Lewis is using it in his own very peculiar fashion in the Narnia Chronicles. It's beautiful once you see it. And it helps explain some of the otherwise puzzling oddities and peculiarities about the Narnia series, which people have complained about and said, oh, Narnia is a bit of a hodgepodge. It's a mishmash. It's slapdash. Lewis just threw these things together in a slipshod sort of way. But of course, Lewis didn't. He was not a characteristically random or slapdash writer or thinker. Everything is minutely particularized in order to generate the atmosphere that he's wanting to evoke. And he says in his book on the Psalms, which we should speak about really, because this is the only book he wrote on the Bible, Reflection on the Psalms. He says in that book that God is the teaching of our Lord, he says, is not given in that sort of formulaic, cut and dried, easy to master, systematic fashion that we might have desired. It can't be got up. It can't be learned as you would learn a subject. You can't just look at Jesus's teaching as you would look at the railway timetable or the television listings. No, the teaching of Jesus is elusive. It's parabolic. Jesus teaches through parables more than anything else. And his own life is a story, not a system of thought. Therefore, coming to know God, Lewis says, is much more like breathing an atmosphere than it is like learning a subject. And atmosphere for Lewis was an absolutely key term when it came to storytelling. A good story should have a pervasive atmosphere or flavor or tone. He hated books which had no atmosphere. He says that, The Three Musketeers, for instance, has a rollicking great plot, terribly exciting sequence of events. But he says the complete lack of atmosphere repels me. The characters go from London to Paris, but there's no sense that Paris is any different from London. There's no three-dimensionality. There's no pith. There's no texture to the world. And giving an atmosphere to an imagined country was absolutely fundamental for Lewis. With the planetary personalities, he's able to do two things at once. Give Narnia an atmosphere and have Aslan, the Christ figure, sum it up in his own person, which theologically is really profound. Because, of course, Jesus, the Word of God, is the Word by whom all things have come into being, but also the Word of God who is made flesh in Jesus. And so there should be a sort of correspondence, a harmony between the incarnate Jesus and the discarnate, the unincarnate Word that is holding all things in being. Now, the planets allow Lewis to do that in Narnia. So the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe is a generally jovial world, but Aslan is the incarnation of Jupiter in the kingly person. It's absolutely brilliant what Lewis was up to, and this is one of the reasons why Narnia has become such a classic in English children's fiction, because Lewis's genius was able to draw upon this huge wealth of symbolic material, but also condense it and simplify it in such a way that it was accessible to 5-year-old children. It's amazing. These works are absolutely works of genius, if you ask me.
Yeah, I catch myself thinking when you're describing it, take the word Narnia out, you're sometimes describing the Bible, right? Saying, all the things that you have to understand in order to understand the Bible itself, the symbolism, you have to have secondary literature, you have to understand the context, the history. And it seems like he didn't just borrow the story of the gospel for Narnia. He actually borrowed the whole idea of how the Bible is written, how it's composed of multiple different books to enable to understand it.
Absolutely. I'm glad you said that, because it allows me to talk about my favorite passage of the Bible, which is Luke 24, the road to Emmaus story, where Jesus, the resurrected Christ, falls in step with a couple of his disciples, but they don't recognize him. And he begins to explain to them that the Messiah must have suffered and died as the scriptures foretold, and beginning with Moses. And he explains to them in the scriptures all the things concerning himself. But they don't recognize him. Their hearts burn, but it's only when he goes in to eat with them that they recognize him. So you've got the sort of the vast story of Christ throughout the whole of the scriptures, but it's only in the interpersonal relationship with Jesus that the disciples recognize him. And that's why, to put it bluntly, the incarnation happened, because the revelation of God throughout the history of the people of Israel was leading up to this culminating point. That was where the whole story was going to eventuate. And if you don't read a book all the way to the final chapter, as it were, you don't read the story of Israel all the way to Jesus, you're missing the point of the story.
That's fascinating. You could actually copy and paste the Emmaus story and put it right into the Narnia story before Aslan comes back to life. That's wow, yeah. Never thought of it this way. Let's talk about a little bit of the other pieces of literature, the works that C.S. Lewis did. You mentioned the Psalms, you mentioned a few other pieces. I'm going to go into one that I'm fascinated about, the Perelandra trilogy, right, where he goes a step further. A lot of people don't know this, but it's a funky piece of literature, to use that term. It's kind of hard to understand, and he takes another step from Narnia. That kind of explain that to us. I want to introduce people to some of the pieces that of C.S. Lewis's work that are not as popular and as obvious as the Narnia story.
Yes, so Lewis wrote a trilogy of interplanetary adventures. They were published before Narnia. They came out mostly during the Second World War, and they are called Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength. The first book is set on Mars, the second book is set on Venus, and the third book is set on Earth, and begins with the word matrimony. That's the very first word of the third book, because the third book is all about this young couple who are unhappily married, and that's because they are not living into their masculinity and femininity, respectively, which have been laid out for us in the first two books. Because, as we know, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. And the first books...
So that was there before the book was written.
Well, yes, I mean, traditionally, just classically, Mars is the masculine warrior, and Venus is the beautiful lady. Mars and Venus, Ares and Aphrodite. Again, Lewis, as a classicist, knew all this in his bones. And so, having introduced the qualities of masculinity in the first book, the qualities of femininity in Perelandra, then in the third book, Lewis shows how they work out. They come down to earth in this very mundane marriage. That's, I think, the best way of understanding the trilogy. It's a fine set of books, but they're very different from each other. And there's a lot going on in the books which might distract you from this theme of gender and marriage. So, for instance, in the second book, Perelandra, there's a temptation scene where the lady of Perelandra, this unfallen world, is tempted. And there are clear echoes, of course, of the temptation scene in the Garden of Eden, in the first chapters of the book of Genesis. And a lot of biblically informed people immediately zero in on this. It's all about Genesis. And of course, there's a lot of Genesis being reworked. in that story. But equally, there's a lot of the Garden of the Hesperides being reworked, because the Garden of the Hesperides in Greek mythology also featured an orchard of immortality-giving apple trees. And Lewis is, as it were, combining his biblical knowledge and his classical mythological knowledge. Again, as you would expect for someone so learned as C.S. Lewis. And that's why, it's important to know your Bible, of course, and that's why the Museum of the Bible does such great work. But in order to understand Lewis, you also need to understand the classics.
Yeah. So would you say that C.S. Lewis was first an apologist or first the author? How was it coming at the same time? Did one influence the other? Well, what's the dynamic there with him?
He says of himself that the imaginative man in him is older and more continuously operative than the rational man. So in other words, he's more of a poet than he is a philosopher working in propositions. He thinks symbolically, he thinks mythically, more naturally, more fundamentally than he thinks in these other terms. He can do it, and he does it very well. But his more natural language is story, is drama, narrative. But we were talking about his other works. Can I just mention two others?
Please.
Three others, because you are the Museum of the Bible, and people ought to know of Lewis's interactions with the Bible, because I've just been saying, you need to understand the classics, but of course you need to understand the Bible to understand Lewis as well, because he was immersed in both. And some of the places where he writes explicitly about the Bible, aside from his book on the Psalms. Are these. He wrote an essay called Fernseed and Elephants, which is an attack upon modern methods of biblical criticism.
Okay.
He wrote an essay called The Literary Impact of the Authorized Version. So the authorized version of the Bible, the King James Version. Lewis wrote an essay all about its literary impact. And then in his biggest book, the fattest book he ever wrote, which was his English Literature in the 16th Century Excluding Drama, a snappy title if ever there was one, he has a whole chapter on translations of the Bible into English in that century.
So what's his take?
So he has an interesting discussion of Tyndale and Coverdale and other people from that era. And well, to summarize his take is almost impossible for me to do.
That's another book.
It's really dense literary criticism and literary history. But, Lewis read these biblical translations from the point of view of a literary historian. He's not talking theologically about them. He's just saying, how they worked in the history of the language and the literature of that period. But, it shows that Lewis was able to engage with the Bible, not just personally, in his own spiritual walk, but also intellectually from the point of view of someone who knew about literary criticism and literary history.
Yeah, but it seems like the debater in him influenced whatever he did in his work, whether it was more literary and using imaginative works and fictitious stories, or head-on arguments for why you should be a believer in like mere Christianity. So it that's kind of seems to be the thread to how this works. Is that right?
Well, he's often talking for victory. Yes, he's a born debater. He likes to make his point and persuade you of its correctness, whether that's in his apologetics or his literary criticism, or even in his fictional worlds, because his fictional worlds they're very vivid. They're very persuasive and intense. You get caught up in his worlds because he sees everything with such precision and clarity and wants to make you see it in the same way. Francis Spufford, who's a very prominent British novelist right now, has written interestingly about Lewis from this point of view, that when Spufford read Narnia as a child, he said it's like holding a live wire. You get a sudden electric shock because Lewis writes with such immediacy and vividness. It's like 1,000 volts jolting right through you. Because he had such a powerful mind and such he as people said about him after his death, he took in more, he felt more, he saw more, he sensed more than the average person. But the unusual thing about him was that he was able to communicate much of that very powerfully in his various writings. So I think that's another reason for the success of Narnia, that it's got a very strong flavor, or perhaps I should say set of flavors, 7 different flavors, according to each of the planetary personalities.
You hinted to it a few times, but what do you think the relationship in regards from Lewis's perspective is, the partnership between theology and his fictional work? Is he, other than explaining the gospel, making an argument for the correctness of the Bible, the validity of the Bible and its message? What is his teaching? Is he teaching beyond the I'm being right about what I believe? Is there something that goes beyond that?
Oh, yes. I mean, he's not always arguing for victory. I mean, there are works of his which are much more ruminative and meditative, sort of more pastoralia than apologetics. So his book on prayer, for instance, Letters to Malcolm, his book on, even his book on the Psalms is much more a sort of comparing of notes. Because Lewis wasn't a biblical scholar, technically speaking. He didn't have any Hebrew, for instance. So when he's writing about the Psalms, he's not doing so from the point of view of a Hebraist. He's reading them in English translations, and he's sharing thoughts that occurred to him as a believer about ways that we might read the Psalms and things we might get out of them. So he's not trying to beat you over the head with an argument in that book. Likewise, his book on love, The Four Loves, is very sort of exploratory and psychologically probing about the different ways in which love can go wrong. And then perhaps his greatest work, what he certainly regarded as his best work, is his last novel, Till We Have Faces, which is, again, a retelling of a classical myth, the myth of Cupid and Psyche, but done so, again, obviously through his Christian lens. But it's largely about how love can go wrong, how love can become possessive and controlling. One needs to let go of those that we love and not treat them as puppets to serve our own ends, but allow them to be themselves and allow ourselves to be, a son or a daughter of God, and not try to make God into our own puppet that we control. Of course, we can't do that, though we try to. And that's what lies behind all idolatry, that we don't want the real God. We prefer our own man-made gods.
Yeah, and it feels like, when things become personal, we're often as our best, we're often as substantive as we can be. You mentioned Shadowlands and the exploration of one of the things that was very personal to him, pain, right? I think that's anything that's related to his personal story and the suffering that he in his life went through. That's where he really comes out, where he is a person, where he apply his theology, and that's where he kind of talks about his struggles. Can you talk us through that a little bit more?
Yeah, so he'd suffered a lot, especially in the first 20 years of his life. I mentioned that his mother died when he was just not quite 10. Then he went to a terrible school. Within a couple of weeks of his mother's death, C.S. Lewis was sent across the Irish Sea, because he was raised in Belfast in the north of Ireland, and he was sent to England, which itself is a remarkable thing for his father to have done, just weeks after he's lost his mother. So he's sent to this foreign country and to a school which is just about the worst school in England. It's like something out of Dickens. Those cruel headmasters in Dickens, like Wackford Squeers. This headmaster of this school was a sadist, really. He liked beating the boys, flogging them mercilessly, and he was later certified insane and died in a lunatic asylum. Um, Now, Lewis, fortunately, wasn't really one of his victims, but he had to see other boys being victimized by this madman. And then another 5 years go by, and 5 or 6, and Lewis is in the trenches of the Great War, fighting in France as a soldier in the British Army. And he's very nearly killed. And he sees sitting and standing corpses. He's blown up in the spring of 1918, and he's nearly killed, and spends 6 months recovering from his war wounds, and all this before he's 20. So it's interesting that later on in his life, after he's become a Christian, there are 2 books which really tackle head-on the question of suffering. And the first of these is The Problem of Pain, and the second of them is A Grief Observed. Now, The Problem of Pain is very philosophical. It's very argumentative. Lewis is reasoning his way to a conclusion about why we can still believe in the goodness of God, even in the face of suffering. Whereas A Grief Observed is much more personal, subjective, emotional, raw, about the experience of someone going through the suffering of bereavement. Because his wife has died, that's what the book is about. And Lewis is asking all the darkest and deepest, most difficult questions, railing, as it were, against God for putting him through this. And the point of A Grief Observed is not really to explain how one can believe in God despite suffering. It's to show that someone, at least this person, the author of this book, he can find his way through the maze and gradually recover his equilibrium and his faith and his belief in the goodness of God. But it's shown, it's not told. It's very, very different from The Problem of Pain. And in fact, it was published anonymously, and Lewis deliberately disguised his writing style in A Grief Observed so that people wouldn't guess that it had been written by him. And it only came out under his own name after his death.
Well, Dr. Ward, I was hoping that we would discover the diversity and the multifaceted works of C.S. Lewis, and I think you did a fantastic job kind of teasing, at least, some of those different types of work, ending with a very personal part of his work. So what we'll do, hopefully you can help us a little bit with it, we'll summarize some of those pieces and make some recommendations in our show notes for people to dive deeper into the works of C.S. Lewis. We don't want to distract from Narnia. Obviously, you wrote books about Narnia itself, and we're fascinated by it, but I think it's certainly worth to explore all the other works that he did, because, like you said, there's so much to C.S. Lewis that is not obvious or doesn't jump out to the common observer or moviegoer. Right? So thank you very much for this dimension of a very fascinating person and for your work and ministry.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Matthias. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you for joining us at Unscrolled. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Like I said, look out in the show notes for additional information about Dr. Ward and the works of C.S. Lewis. And give us a thumbs up, share about Unscrolled so more people find out about conversations like these. See you next time. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you liked this conversation, if you learned something new, then share it with your family and friends, or leave us a review so more people can find out about the history, narrative, and impact of the Bible. Be sure to follow us here or on your social media platform of choice. See or hear you next time on Unscrolled.